Daniel Carter had everything a man could want: a billion-dollar company, luxury cars, a penthouse overlooking the city. People admired him. Some feared him. But no one really knew him. His days followed the same routine: early morning meetings, high-stakes negotiations, exclusive dinners. Every moment was about making money. He never walked, only drove. Never waited, always had people waiting for him. Life was a blur of deals, investments, and success. Yet despite all his wealth, something felt missing. Daniel didn't think about it much. He distracted himself with work, telling himself he had no time for anything else. One night, after a long meeting, he left his office, exhausted. His driver waited outside with the usual black luxury car. The city lights shimmered around him, but he barely noticed. The world outside his bubble felt distant. The people on the sidewalks, the noise of the streets, it all faded into the background. Until he saw her. A woman sat on the pavement near the entrance of a high-end restaurant. Her clothes were worn. She clutched a thin blanket around her shoulders, shielding herself from the cold. Daniel had seen homeless people before. They were everywhere. But for some reason, he hesitated this time. Something about her made him stop. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, a strange pull, and before he could talk himself out of it, he took a step toward her. The woman sat quietly, her eyes staring at the ground. Her name was Emma. She'd been living on the streets for years. Once, she had a normal life. A job, a small apartment, a routine. But life had a way of turning everything upside down. It started with losing her job. Then her savings ran out. The bills piled up. Soon she had no home, no family to turn to. At first, she told herself it was temporary. She just needed time to get back on her feet. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Now survival was her only goal. She learned to sleep where it was safest: bus stops, park benches, near store entrances. Some nights were colder than others. Some nights she didn't sleep at all. People passed by her every day. Some looked at her with pity. Others avoided her as if she were invisible. But she was used to it. She didn't beg. She didn't ask for anything. She just waited. Waited for the kind stranger who might spare some change. Waited for the day her luck would turn around. That night, she was colder than usual. She hadn't eaten in a while, and her stomach ached. Then, a shadow blocked the streetlight in front of her. She looked up. A man in an expensive suit stood there watching her. She recognized the look in his eyes: confusion, hesitation. People like him didn't stop for people like her. Yet, for some reason, he did. And that small act would change both of their lives forever. Emma kept her eyes on the man standing in front of her. She had seen plenty of wealthy people walk past. They never stopped, never looked. But this man was different. Daniel hesitated, unsure why he was even standing there. He could have just walked away, gone back to his life. But something about her made him pause. "Have you eaten?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Emma blinked. People didn't usually ask that. They either ignored her or tossed a few coins before walking off. She shook her head. "Not today." Daniel exhaled. He glanced at the restaurant behind him. It was one of the most expensive in the city. He had been coming here for years, never thinking twice about how much he spent on a meal. "Come with me," he said. Emma hesitated. She wasn't used to kindness. Sometimes people offered things only to take them back. But there was something different about this man. He didn't look at her with pity. Just curiosity. Slowly, she stood up, wrapping her thin blanket around herself. Inside the restaurant, the warm air hit her immediately. The smell of food made her stomach tighten. The hostess frowned when she saw Emma. "Sir, do you need a different table?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "A table for two." A few customers glanced their way. Some whispered. Daniel ignored them. He pulled out a chair for Emma and sat down. The waiter hesitated before handing them menus. Emma barely touched hers. She hadn't looked at a menu in years. "Order whatever you want," Daniel said. She hesitated, then picked something simple: soup. Bread. When the food arrived, she ate slowly, savoring every bite. Daniel watched, not speaking. For once, he wasn't thinking about work, money, or deals. He was just sitting there, sharing a meal with someone who had nothing. When Emma finally looked up, she smiled. "Thank you." Daniel nodded, but he didn't know why this moment felt so important, and he had no idea that this simple dinner would change his life forever. Emma wiped her mouth with a napkin, still savoring the warmth of the meal. It had been a long time since she had eaten something this good. Daniel watched her in silence. He wasn't sure why he had done this. It wasn't like him to stop for strangers. He had given money to charities before. But this was different. Emma looked up and met his eyes. "I don't know why you did this, but thank you." Daniel shrugged. "It's just a meal." She smiled slightly. "To you, maybe." The waiter returned with the check. Daniel barely glanced at it before pulling out his wallet. He paid, then reached into his pocket and took out a few bills. "Here," he said, handing her the money. Emma hesitated before taking it. "I appreciate this, really. But I don't want to be a burden." Daniel frowned. He had expected her to take the money without question. Most people would. But she looked almost embarrassed. "You're not a burden," he said simply. Emma folded the bills carefully and placed them in her pocket. She studied him for a moment, then said something unexpected. "One day I'll return the favor." Daniel almost laughed. The idea of a homeless woman repaying a billionaire seemed ridiculous. But something in her voice made him pause. She wasn't joking. "You don't have to do that," he said. She just smiled. "We'll see." Daniel stood up. "Take care, Emma." She nodded. "You too, Daniel." He walked out of the restaurant, his driver already waiting by the curb. As the car pulled away, he looked out the window one last time. Emma was still sitting there, watching him leave. He told himself he had done a good thing. That was all that mattered. By tomorrow he would forget about this moment. Or at least, that's what he thought. Because in just a few days, his entire world would fall apart. Daniel walked into his office the next morning, ready for another busy day. His schedule was packed. Meetings, calls, decisions that involved millions of dollars. But something felt off. His assistant looked nervous. Employees whispered in the hallways. There was tension in the air. Then came the news. Someone had leaked confidential company files to the public. Sensitive information, private deals, financial records, and hidden legal issues was now everywhere. The media exploded with headlines. Investors panicked. The company's stock price plummeted in hours. Daniel's phone rang non-stop. Lawyers, board members, angry clients. Everyone wanted answers. He tried to fix it. Called meetings. Spoke to lawyers. But the damage was done. And then, it got worse. Regulators launched an investigation. Lawsuits started piling up. Bank accounts were frozen. Deals were canceled. His empire was collapsing. A week ago, he had everything. Now, he was losing it all. The final blow came when his closest business partner betrayed him. Someone he trusted had been behind the leak, selling information to competitors for millions. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the empty walls. Just days ago, they were covered with awards and stock certificates. Now, they were bare. Security knocked on his door. "I'm sorry, sir. The company board has made a decision. You need to leave the premises." He was fired from the company he built. Daniel walked out of the building, past employees who once respected him. Now they only stared or looked away. By the end of the week, his bank accounts were nearly empty. The luxury apartment, the cars, everything. Gone. And then, reality hit. He had nowhere to go, no friends to call, no family to help. For the first time in his life, Daniel Carter had nothing. By nightfall, he found himself wandering the streets, his expensive suit now wrinkled and useless. He had passed by homeless people before, never giving them a second thought. Now, he was one of them. Alone. Cold. Hungry. He sat down on a bench, exhausted, and that's when he heard a voice. "You look like you need a meal." He looked up. Emma stood in front of him, holding a small bag of food. Daniel blinked, unsure if he was seeing things. Emma stood in front of him, holding a small paper bag. Her clothes were still worn, her face still tired, but her eyes held something he no longer had: strength. "You." He started, but his throat was dry. He hadn't spoken to anyone in hours. Emma sat beside him on the bench just like he once had with her. She handed him the bag. "It's not much, but it'll help." Daniel hesitated before taking it. He unwrapped the sandwich inside, the smell of food making his stomach twist. He hadn't eaten since yesterday. Slowly, he took a bite. It wasn't a fancy steak dinner, it wasn't even warm. But right now, it was the best thing he had ever tasted. Emma watched him, not saying much. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't question why a man who once wore tailored suits was now sitting on a park bench with nothing. She just sat with him. Daniel finally spoke. "I lost everything." Emma nodded, as if she already knew. For the first time in his life, Daniel had no power, no money, no way to fix things, and yet, here was a woman who had nothing, offering him something anyway. He swallowed hard, looking down at the food in his hands. I don't know what to do. Emma sighed. You figure it out, one day at a time. Daniel had spent years controlling everything in his life. Now he had no control at all, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to truly start over. Daniel sat in silence, holding the half-eaten sandwich in his hands. He had spent his whole life believing money solved everything, that success meant control. But here he was, broke, homeless, sitting beside the very woman he once helped. Emma didn't pity him. She didn't offer empty words or sympathy. She simply sat there, watching the streets like she had done for years. You'll get used to it, she finally said. Daniel frowned. I don't want to get used to this. Emma smirked. Neither did I. For the first time, he really looked at her, not just as a homeless person, but as someone who had survived what he was only now beginning to understand. How do you do it? He asked. Emma sighed. You stop thinking about what you lost. You focus on what's in front of you, one step at a time. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hands together. The cold was sharper now, biting through his thin clothes. He had never noticed before how unforgiving the night could be. Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a tattered scarf. She handed it to him. Take it, you'll need it. Daniel hesitated but took it. Why are you helping me? Emma gave him a knowing smile. Because once, you helped me. He had thought that meal was just a small act of kindness. But now, sitting in the same position Emma once had, he realized how much it had meant, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood the value of kindness. The nights were the hardest. Daniel shivered under the thin scarf Emma had given him, his body aching from sleeping on cold benches. He had never known hunger like this, never felt the weight of being ignored, unseen. But Emma was always there. She didn't make things easy for him, but she showed him how to survive, where to find food, which shelters were safe, how to stay warm when the temperatures dropped. She taught him things he had never thought he would need to know. One day, she handed him a flyer for a community shelter. They help people find jobs, she said. It's a start. Daniel hesitated. The man he used to be would have scoffed at the idea of a shelter. But that man was gone, so he went. It wasn't easy. The jobs available weren't glamorous, dishwashing, warehouse work, cleaning. But for the first time in his life, Daniel understood the value of work beyond money. He took a small job at a local store, minimum wage, long hours. But he showed up every day, working harder than he ever had before. Emma checked in on him, still living on the streets, still surviving. You're doing good, she said one evening. Daniel nodded, staring at the city skyline. He used to look down at the world from the top. Now he saw it from the ground, and strangely, it felt more real. He wasn't the same man he used to be. He was something else, something better. Months passed. Daniel worked hard, saving every dollar he could. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He wasn't even rich. But he was surviving, and for the first time in his life, that felt like enough. He still saw Emma often. She checked in on him like an older sister, always making sure he was eating, staying warm, keeping his head up. One evening, after his shift at the store, Daniel found her sitting on the same bench where they first met. She looked tired, weaker than usual. Emma, he said, sitting beside her. When was the last time you had a real meal? She waved him off. I'm fine. Daniel shook his head. No, you're not. She sighed, rubbing her hands together. It's just how it is. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his paycheck. He had been saving for months, hoping to get a small apartment, but instead, he folded a few bills and handed them to her. Emma stared at the money. Daniel, I can't. Yes, you can, he interrupted. It's not charity. It's what you did for me when I had nothing. Emma hesitated, her fingers tightening around the money. There's a shelter downtown, Daniel continued. They can help you. A real bed, warm meals, job programs. It's time, Emma. She looked at him, eyes filled with something between pride and sadness. You really changed, huh? Daniel smiled. You changed me. Emma finally nodded. Okay. With his help, she checked into the shelter. It wasn't instant, but little by little, she began rebuilding her life just like he had. A few weeks later, Daniel got in touch with an old business contact, someone who owed him a favor. He found Emma a job at a community center helping others who had been in her position. She hesitated at first, but eventually she accepted. One evening, they sat together, drinking cheap coffee outside the shelter. "I told you I'd return the favor," she said, smirking. Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, you did." They weren't rich, they weren't powerful, but they had something far more valuable: a second chance. And this time, neither of them would waste it.